Hello, welcome to this video on assault occasioning actual bodily harm, the third of the non-fatal offences videos following assault and battery. Now this one can be found under section 47 of the Offences Against a Person Act. So it's the first one, which is a statutory offence. So before beginning, we're going to look at the key principles of assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Going forward, we'll just refer to this as ABH. Now, it is the least serious of the non-fatal offences found in the Offence Against a Person Act 1861. Certainly the least that we look at from that Act. Now, Section 47 of the Act really only states the penalty. It does list the elements, but doesn't really explain the elements. So these elements instead are found in common law. So we're going to have to look at cases to understand what's meant by the definition. Now, it is a tribal either way offence, with a maximum of 5 years in prison for the offence if found guilty. So we're going to begin with an overview of what we're going to cover in this video. We're going to begin with the definition of assault occasioning ABH. We're going to look at the actus reus of section 47 of ABH, breaking those constituent elements into assault occasioning and actual bodily harm, and finally look at the mens rea of the offence too. So we'll begin with the definition of the assault occasioning ABH. So the definition of ABH then does come from statute under section 47 of the Offences Against a Person Act 1861. It gives us whosoever shall be convicted of indictment of any assault occasioning actual bodily harm shall be liable to imprisonment for any term not exceeding 5 years. So what we got then is the definition of assault occasioning ABH is that it occurs when the defendant commits either an assault or battery which causes actual bodily harm. So like I said earlier, we're going to be looking to case law to understand what each of these elements means. So as in any problem question, and the first thing you're going to do is define the offence, and then we're going to go straight into applying the elements and explaining the elements. So we'll start with the actus reus, as we always do, of section 47 ABH, with particular focus then on assault. So we know it's assault occasioning actual bodily harm. We're going to look at what each of those constituent elements means, and we're going to look at common law, which explains what each element means also. So assault, despite the fact then that the Act uses the term assault, section 47 has been interpreted as being committed by the common law offence of either assault or battery. Now, in other words, there's no need for any direct physical contact between the defendant and the victim if it's an assault, but if there is, then that's of course going to be battery. So we mentioned in the assault and battery videos, they are constituent elements, they are underpinning elements of the non-fatal crime, non-fatal offences we're going to look at, particularly for ABH. So the prosecution must prove then that there's an assault or battery. So what we need to do in an application question for assault or battery is not forget or neglect all of the elements. So assault or battery, so if it's battery, it's the application of unlawful force, for example. So we need to go through each of those elements in order for assault or battery to be present. Now, of course, once you do assault, you can look to the case law from assault for that. Often there are some crossovers in terms of the teaching in the videos for that anyway. The second element then is occasioning. Now, occasioning is an underpinning element for all crimes, and what this means basically is causation. So did the assault or battery cause actual bodily harm? Now the word occasioning just means causing, and usually involves some direct contact, of course, between the defendant and the victim if there is a battery, but of course if it's an assault then it won't do. Now, however, the cases of DPP and K were minor, as we looked at in the battery video, and Roberts illustrate that ABH can be committed indirectly, so without even direct contact between the defendant and the victim. So this won't be new information to you after looking at assault and battery. So what the prosecutor has to do then is just prove that link between the defendant's act and the victim's injuries. And this can be determined in the same way as causation. In those causation elements you will have learned. So we've got the but-for test, and we've got the de minimis or Kimsey more than minimal test, or indeed that it's more than trivial cause. So all the constituent elements, of course, we've got the idea of multiple causes. We've got thin scroll rule, they all still apply here. So it may be the case that there are causation elements you need to discuss. So you should review your causation notes there. And so the clincher, the difference between then those offences we looked at already, occasioning we looked at already, or in terms of causation, we're going to analyse actual bodily harm. So this is where we're going to see cases which illustrate what actual bodily harm is and the charging standards and so on. So the beginning point then, or at least in terms of academic study, is defined in Miller. So actual bodily harm was defined in Miller in 1954 as any hurt or injury calculated to interfere with the health or comfort of the victim. Now later on, from 1994, this has changed slightly, and ABH was taken to mean harm means injury, and actual means not so trivial as to be wholly insignificant. The definition was extended further in a sense, and in this case it was deemed that bodily harm is not limited to harm to the skin, flesh and bones of the victim. It includes organs, nervous system and the brain, including the mind. So Miller, the defendant, was charged with the rape and ABH of his wife, and the judge in the case indicated, as we said, that ABH includes any hurt or injury calculated to interfere with the health or comfort of the victim, and includes mental as well as physical injury. Whereas we have Chamfook, where the defendant locked his victim in a room and questioned him robustly, believing him to have stolen an engagement ring. Now, he was injured while trying to escape from the second floor room. Now, in determining whether this amounted to actual bodily harm, Lord Justice Hubhouse in the Court of Appeal said that actual, as we say, means that although the injury needs not be permanent, it should not be trivial as to be wholly insignificant. So, for example, you've got bruises, they're not going to become under actual bodily harm. And then we've got bodily, means the victim's body, his organs, his nervous system and his brain. And then we've got harm, which is a synonym for injury. So therefore then, the meaning of ABH is that the injury needs not be permanent but not trivial. Now, although ABH is capable of including psychiatric injury, it does not include mere emotions as well, such as fear, distress, panic, or states of mind that are not in themselves evidence of some identifiable clinical condition. So if the harm is mental, then of course we need to make sure we've got medical evidence of that. And the language in any problem question is going to be key here. So we know then, ABH is a wide definition. Now the definition then would take into account bruises, scratches, broken nose, even for psychiatric injury, but not mere emotions such as fear, distress or panic. Now, whilst a bruise technically constitutes ABH, it's unlikely the CPS will prosecute as such, so it's more likely that we'll go into battery if we're categorising offences. Now in T and DPP, the victim was chased by a defendant and the victim fell to the ground and was kicked by the defendant. This caused the victim to lose consciousness for a brief period, and so what we have is a development here. Losing consciousness even momentarily can constitute ABH. In Smith, the defendant cut off his former partner's ponytail with a pair of scissors, and the High Court set out that ABH is not limited to skins, flesh and bones. It applies to all parts of the body, including hair. And the defendant was guilty of ABH. Now, obiter dicta in this case as well, the judge decided that if paint or some other unpleasant substance were to be put in the victim's hair, that also could amount to actual bodily harm. So injuries such as broken teeth or broken tooth, loss of consciousness, minor cuts which require medical treatment like stitches, minor fractures, and the extensive bruising or multiple bruising could then all be considered ABH. Now, since the key ruling in Chamfook in 1994, psychiatric injury can also be regarded as ABH. Now, what that does mean then is that the Miller definition really is now inadequate. I mean, if we think that was from 1954, of course, things have developed since then in terms of knowledge of harm and so on. So we would use the Chamfook definition going forward. Now, in Burstow, again, this approved this point that bodily harm can include a recognisable psychiatric illness such as depression, PTSD, anxiety, stress, and so on. Now, Constanza, again, clinical depression amounted to ABH, so the actual bodily harm was harm of the mind, again there. In Ireland, again, psychiatric harm resulting from silent telephone calls, again, amounted to ABH. So to sum up then, as we going back to Chamfuk, actual means that the injury doesn't need to be permanent, but not wholly insignificant either. Bodily includes all parts of the victim's body, his organs, his nervous system and his brain. Obviously we looked at cases as to where that extends a little. And harm is just a synonym for injury. So therefore ABH is an injury to the body or the mind which need not be permanent but more than trivial. Now in terms of charging standards, we would need to know these to extend our knowledge, of course. So the injuries sustained in ABH will generally be more severe than those which amount to a battery and have been agreed by the joint charging standard. So we've got things like loss or breaking of a tooth or teeth, temporary loss of sensory functions, which may include loss of consciousness, but may also include things like temporary deafness or blindness. Extensive or multiple bruising would be considered ABH. A displaced broken nose, minor fractures, minor but not merely superficial cuts of sore requiring treatment, and then psychiatric injury, which is more than just fear, distress or panic. So when identifying in a scenario, you would need to consider these as a starting point for ABH. Now in terms of abrasions, bruises, a black eye, reddening of the skin, swelling, superficial cuts, scratches, grazes, they're more likely to be charged as battery under section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act instead, even though technically they could be considered ABH according to the definition. So it's important we get this right in scenario questions, because this is what will be the guide as to the level of harm and what the charge is. So once we dealt again with the actus reus, so we said assault, what assault is assault of battery, occasioning means causing, and actual bodily harm, which we just defined in the past few moments. We're now going to look at the mens rea for section 47 ABH. So the good and bad news is you don't have to learn any extra mens rea for ABH. What you do need to remember though, the bad news, is that the mens rea for the relevant assault of battery you need to remember. So all you need to do then is briefly mention that the mens rea for section 47 ABH is that of the original assault of battery as discussed above, if that's the way you did things. If not, then of course you'd have to break it down into the elements, so attention or recklessness, either direct or oblique intent or recklessness, as to the application of unlawful force, for example, if you've gone with battery, if that's the ABH. So where the defendant either intends or is reckless in terms of the assault of battery, if he causes harm which constitutes ABH, is guilty of a section 47 offence. So we looked at some key cases. So we got Roberts. So in this case, the victim was a passenger in the defendant's car and injured herself when jumping from the vehicle whilst it was moving. Now the defendant had the mens rea to commit a battery, and the injuries were caused by the battery, so he was guilty of section 47 ABH. Although the battery was committed indirectly. In Sprat, the defendant was firing an air pistol from his flat window at a target downstairs when he hit a 7-year-old girl he'd not seen. Now, the court held to test for recklessness in ABH was subjective, i.e. the facts as the defendant saw them, and this was later proved in Savage and Parmenter. So subjective recklessness is a recklessness we use, and there was no intent or recklessness here. In Savage, a famous case, the defendant had thrown a glass of beer over her husband's former lover in a pub. The glass slipped out of her hand, broke and cut the victim's wrist. Now this was a joint appeal, but the House of Lords ruled here that the mens rea of assault occasioning ABH was the same as mens rea for common assault. It's not necessary to show the defendant intended bodily harm or was reckless as to whether bodily harm would result. Rather, it was sufficient to show for him to of course, the harm as a result of either putting the person intentionally or recklessly in apprehension of unlawful personal violence, therefore assault, or touch the victim unlawfully, either intentionally or recklessly, and that would be battery. Now the sentencing, as mentioned earlier on, is section 47 offence against a person. Act 1861 provides the sentence, so it's a triable either way offence and subject to a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment. That should always be in any conclusion. And that's it. So we've now dealt with the definition of ABH. We broke down the actus reus elements and the good news, bad news situation of the mens rea section 47 ABH. In that we just need the mens rea for assault or battery. Thanks for watching.